The Sherman tank rumbled to a stop somewhere in the Bocage country of Normandy, July 1944. 5 British tankers had been buttoned up inside their steel box for nearly 6 hours, breathing fumes, sweat, and the metallic taste of cordite. The landscape had gone quiet. No German shells screaming overhead, no machine gun fire rattling against the hull. Finally, a chance to relax. The commander gave the order every crew member desperately wanted to hear. "Right lads, let's brew up." Within minutes the driver had clambered out, pulled a small Primus stove from his kit, and began preparing tea on the engine deck. The wireless operator gathered the mugs. Another crew member fetched the tins of condensed milk and sugar. It was a ritual, as British as the Union Jack painted on their turret. For 10 precious minutes, these men would be human again, not just component parts of a fighting machine. Steam rose from the billy can as the water began to boil. They never saw the German Panther positioning itself 300 meters away through the hedgerow. The first armor-piercing round punched through the Sherman's side armor before anyone could react. The second set the fuel tanks ablaze. Of the 5 crew members, 3 died instantly. The 2 who escaped suffered burns across 60% of their bodies. The war diary of the 2nd Fife and Forfar Yeomanry recorded it simply. 1 tank, 5 casualties, crew dismounted for tea. This wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the North African campaign, from El Alamein in October 1942 onwards, British tank units reported similar losses. Crews would halt their vehicles, expose themselves to brew tea, and present German anti-tank gunners with stationary targets. The ritual was so predictable that Wehrmacht training manuals specifically instructed gunners to wait for the British tea ceremony before firing. A motionless tank with crew members visible on the deck became what artillerymen called a Brewerziel, a brewer's target. The mathematics were brutal. Analysis conducted by the Royal Armoured Corps in late 1943 revealed that tank crews brewing externally spent an average of 12 minutes, completely exposed and vulnerable. During those 12 minutes, situational awareness dropped to nearly zero. Men focused on kettles rather than scanning for threats. Reaction time to enemy contact increased from roughly 4 seconds when buttoned up to over 30 seconds when dismounted. In armoured warfare, that 26-second difference meant the space between life and death. Yet asking British soldiers to abandon tea was like asking them to fight naked. Since 1815, the British Army had issued tea rations to every soldier. By 1942, the daily allocation stood at 1/6 of an ounce per man, enough for roughly 6 strong brews. Tea wasn't merely refreshment, it was a psychological anchor, a taste of home, a moment of normality in the industrialized horror of mechanized warfare. After watching their mates burn alive in knocked-out tanks, after breathing the sweet sick smell of roasting human flesh, these men needed their brew. They needed those 10 minutes of humanity. The problem facing British military planners wasn't whether crews would stop making tea. They wouldn't. The question was how to let them brew without dying for it. The solution would require rethinking the very design of armoured vehicles, installing equipment that would seem absurd to every other nation's military. But first, they needed to understand just how deeply tea had woven itself into the British martial identity. Understanding why British tankers risked death for a cuppa requires going back to the trenches of the First World War. In 1914, the British Army discovered something that would reshape military thinking. Hot tea delivered to frontline troops reduced shell-shock cases by nearly 40%. Medical officers noticed that men who received regular tea rations maintained better mental stability under bombardment than those who didn't. The War Office took notice. By 1916, the Army had established mobile tea brewing facilities that could serve thousands of men daily, even during major offensives along the Somme. The science behind this wasn't mystical, it was biochemistry. Tea contains L-L-theanine, an amino acid that promotes alpha wave activity in the brain, inducing calm alertness without drowsiness. Combined with modest caffeine content, it provided exactly what soldiers needed. Reduced anxiety whilst maintaining combat effectiveness. But more importantly, the ritual itself mattered. Boiling water, warming the pot, steeping the leaves, these familiar actions created brief islands of domestic normality in landscapes of pure destruction. A soldier holding a warm mug wasn't thinking about the artillery barrage scheduled for dawn. He was, for 3 minutes, back home. By 1939, tea had become so embedded in British military culture that the War Office classified it alongside ammunition as an essential supply. When the British Expeditionary Force deployed to France, each company carried specialised tea brewing equipment. Even during the chaotic Dunkirk evacuation in May and June 1940, when soldiers abandoned everything from artillery pieces to personal belongings, they brought their tea kettles. Ships rescuing men from the beaches reported that the most common question wasn't about food or medical care. It was, when's tea? The North African campaign demonstrated tea's role beyond mere morale. In the desert, temperatures inside a tank could exceed 50 degrees Celsius. Crews lost litres of water through perspiration during engagements. Dehydration impaired judgment, slowed reactions, and reduced combat effectiveness within hours. Medical officers found that crews who brewed tea regularly, despite the risks, actually performed better than those who didn't. The tannins in tea aided water absorption, whilst the ritual enforced regular hydration breaks. Men who should have been drinking water wouldn't, but they'd always find time for cha. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery understood this viscerally. After assuming command of the 8th Army in August 1942, one of his first orders concerned tea supplies. He insisted that every forward unit maintain a minimum 3-day reserve of tea, sugar, and condensed milk, stocks that sometimes exceeded ammunition reserves. When logistics officers protested, Montgomery responded bluntly, "I can order men to fight without artillery support if necessary. I cannot order them to fight without tea. They simply won't do it properly." He wasn't exaggerating. In December 1942, during the pursuit following El Alamein, the 7th Armoured Division outran its supply lines. When tea ran out after 3 days, commanders reported disciplinary problems, reduced alertness, and declining morale. Men became irritable, less responsive to orders, and took unnecessary risks. One squadron leader noted in his diary, "The lads would charge a German position for a packet of players, but without char, they'll barely clean their weapons properly." American observers found this incomprehensible. General George Patton famously remarked that British troops would rather have tea than ammunition. He meant it as criticism, but British commanders wore it as a badge of honour. Their men didn't need motivational speeches or threats. They needed proper char. Everything else was negotiable. The challenge was keeping them alive long enough to enjoy it. The 22nd Armoured Brigade kept meticulous records during Operation Crusader in November 1941. Over 17 days of combat operations in Libya, the brigade lost 43 tanks to enemy action. Of these, 16 were destroyed whilst crews were dismounted making tea. That represented 37% of total losses, not from superior German tactics or better armour, but from kettles. The brigade commander, Brigadier Scott Cockburn, wrote in his after-action report, "We are literally brewing ourselves to death." The pattern repeated across every theatre where British armoured units fought. In Tunisia during March 1943, the 6th Armoured Division documented 29 crew casualties, directly attributed to brewing stops. The Churchill tanks would halt, Crews would dismount, and German 88mm anti-tank guns would open fire. The heavy Churchills couldn't accelerate quickly enough, even when buttoned up. Catching them stationary with crew exposed was target practice. One company lost 3 tanks in a single afternoon, all brewing up in the traditional sense before being brewed up in the tanker's grim euphemism for catastrophic fire. What made these losses particularly galling was their preventability. Unlike casualties from combat maneuver or tactical necessity, these deaths served no military purpose whatsoever. A tank commander killed whilst reconnoitring enemy positions died doing his job. A driver killed whilst brewing tea died because he was thirsty. The Royal Armoured Corps calculated that if every tea-related casualty had instead occurred during actual combat operations, British armoured effectiveness would have increased by roughly 12%, the equivalent of adding an entire additional armoured division to the order of battle. The Soviets, receiving British tanks through Lend-Lease, couldn't fathom the behaviour. Russian crews would observe their British counterparts' brewing rituals with bewilderment. Soviet tankers drank vodka cold, ate cold rations, and stayed buttoned up unless absolutely necessary. A Red Army liaison officer stationed with the British 1st Armoured Division in 1943 reported back to Moscow. The English possess adequate tanks and brave soldiers, but they insist on stopping to boil water in the middle of battles. This is either genius or madness. I cannot determine which. German intelligence officers certainly thought it genius for them. Captured documents from the 21st Panzer Division included standing orders to target British tanks that had been stationary for more than 5 minutes, as they were almost certainly brewing. Luftwaffe pilots received similar instructions. Look for small fires or steam near British positions, indicating tea preparation. One German tank ace, Otto Carius, described in his memoirs how his crew would deliberately wait for British tankers to dismount before engaging. Why shoot at a moving, alert target when patience would give you a stationary one with the crew standing about like picnickers? The statistics grew worse in Italy. The mountainous terrain meant fewer places to hull down safely, and German positions on high ground provided excellent observation. Between September 1943 and May 1944, British tank losses in Italy included at least 74 vehicles caught during brewing stops. The Canadian 5th Armoured Division, fighting alongside British units, adopted the same tea-drinking habits and suffered proportionate casualties. Their war diary for April 1944 includes this stark entry. Major Wilson killed, along with his crew, by mortar fire whilst preparing afternoon tea. The teapot survived intact. That last detail, the teapot surviving, captured the absurdity perfectly. Hardened steel and brave men reduced to scorched wreckage, but the enamelled teapot sat undamaged in the dirt, still half full. Something had to change. The solution emerged not from generals or engineers, but from a 28-year-old electrical fitter named Peter Garlick, who'd served as a tank wireless operator in North Africa. Invalided home in early 1943 after his Grant tank took a direct hit near Tobruk, Garlick spent his recovery sketching designs in a Southampton hospital bed. His left hand was wrapped in bandages from burns he'd sustained. Ironically, not from enemy fire, but from scalding tea when his crew's Primus stove tipped during a hasty departure. The idea that kept him awake wasn't revenge against the Germans, but rather a simple question. Why couldn't tanks heat water the same way they heated themselves? Every tank possessed an electrical system that could generate significant power. The wireless sets alone required robust electrical supplies. More importantly, tanks had coolant systems, radiators filled with water that needed heating in cold weather and cooling in hot climates. Garlick's insight was brutally simple. tap into the existing electrical system to heat a small water reservoir. No flames, no exposed crew, no dismounting. Just a switch, 3 minutes wait, and hot water ready for tea. He submitted his sketches to the Ministry of Supply in March 1943. The military establishment's response was predictably dismissive. One senior officer at the War Office noted on Garlick's proposal, "Waste of resources. Tanks are for fighting, not catering." Another scribbled, "Mollycoddling. What next? Armoured bathrooms?" The proposal might have died there, buried under bureaucratic disdain, except that it landed on the desk of Major Anthony Norman, himself a tank veteran who'd lost half his crew during a brewing stop in Libya. Norman recognized the idea's merit immediately and pushed it upward through channels until it reached the Directorate of Tank Design. By August 1943, a prototype existed, a cylindrical stainless steel vessel, roughly the size of a large thermos flask, with an immersion heater element rated at 1000 watts. The initial design could boil 1 pint of water in approximately 2 minutes, using power from the tank's 24-volt electrical system. Engineers at the Fighting Vehicle Proving Establishment in Chobham mounted the prototype in a Churchill tank and conducted trials. The first test failed spectacularly. The vessel ruptured under pressure, spraying boiling water across the turret interior and scalding 2 test crew members. Back to the drawing board. The engineering challenges proved substantial. The vessel needed to withstand the vibrations and shocks of combat without leaking or breaking. It required insulation to prevent burns whilst remaining compact enough to fit into already cramped tank interiors. The electrical system had to be fail-safe. A short circuit in combat could disable the entire tank. Most critically, the heating element needed to operate reliably in temperatures ranging from -20 degrees in Russian winters to +50 degrees in desert summers. Every component required testing, refinement, and retesting. A team at Mechanical Warfare Experimental Establishment, led by Engineer Captain Ronald Hazeldine, spent 9 months perfecting the design. They tested 43 different configurations, materials, and heating element types. The breakthrough came in April 1944 with a double-walled design featuring a vacuum layer for insulation, similar to a thermos flask, but robust enough for military use. The heating element was encased in a copper sheath, preventing direct contact with water and reducing electrical hazard. A pressure relief valve prevented ruptures. The final design could boil a quart of water, enough for 6 mugs of tea, in precisely 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The unit weighed just over 3 pounds empty and could be mounted almost anywhere with access to the electrical system. Installation required cutting a single hole for wiring and 2 mounting brackets. Most importantly, it worked. Trials in May 1944 demonstrated 97% reliability across 200 heating cycles. The boiling vessel was ready for war. The boiling vessel, officially designated the BV Electric Water Heating Unit, MKI, was installed in its first operational tanks in June 1944, just days after D-Day. The unit typically mounted on the turret interior wall, positioned where the loader or wireless operator could reach it without interfering with their primary duties. A simple toggle switch, wired directly to the tank's main electrical bus, controlled operation. Flip it up, wait for the indicator light, and within minutes you had water hot enough to brew proper tea. The interior mechanism was elegantly straightforward. The heating element, a tightly coiled nichrome wire similar to those found in domestic electric kettles, sat encased in a copper tube at the vessel's base. When current flowed through the nichrome wire, electrical resistance generated heat. The copper casing distributed this heat evenly whilst protecting the wire from direct water contact. The double-walled construction created a vacuum layer that served dual purposes.